Judge Caldwell finally snapped, and when he did, the entire federal courtroom froze in real time as U.S. Marshals moved before most people even realized what had been ordered, because what happened next was something almost no one ever expects to witness inside an American courtroom, let alone on camera. A sitting federal judge, exercising absolute authority without hesitation, without theatrics, and without mercy, ordering a defendant physically removed mid-hearing, and then detonating a legal bombshell that instantly changed the course of the case. This wasn't noise, this wasn't drama for attention, this was power being asserted with surgical precision. The hearing had begun like any other routine pretrial appearance, the kind that usually ends quietly with paperwork and scheduling, but from the moment the defendant entered, something felt off. Courtroom observers later described an air of open defiance, subtle at first but unmistakable, no acknowledgement of the bench, whispered remarks to counsel, smirks during procedural language, behavior that seasoned reporters immediately recognized as dangerous territory. Judge Caldwell, a veteran of decades on the federal bench known for restraint and patience, proceeded methodically, addressing preliminary matters before turning to the issue that would ultimately ignite everything: the defendant's compliance with pretrial release conditions. That's when the line was crossed. The defendant interrupted the judge mid-sentence, openly declaring that the court had no authority, that the proceeding was illegitimate, a statement so brazen that the room reportedly went silent. Judge Caldwell paused, not in confusion, but in calculation, and issued one clear warning, calmly stating that respect for the court was not optional and that consequences would be immediate. What followed sealed the defendant's fate. Instead of backing down, the defendant turned away from the bench, gestured dismissively toward the gallery, and continued speaking. In that instant, the temperature in the room dropped. Witnesses say the judge's voice didn't rise, it sharpened. "Marshals, remove this individual from my courtroom immediately," he ordered, and before the sentence was fully finished, 2 U.S. Marshals were already moving. The defendant barely had time to react as officers positioned themselves and escorted him toward the holding area, but the removal itself was only the opening act. As the Marshals moved in, Judge Caldwell continued speaking, placing devastating language on the record, declaring that the defendant had demonstrated willful contempt for the authority of the court and, based not only on that conduct but on a documented pattern of violations, revoking bail effective immediately. That's the moment legal analysts are still talking about. Bail revoked in real time, no recess, no separate hearing, no delay. Freedom ended while the defendant was still being physically removed. Experts reviewing the transcript later emphasized this was not an emotional reaction. It was prepared. Judge Caldwell cited missed pretrial check-ins, violations documented by pretrial services, alleged witness contact despite a no-contact order, and social media activity prosecutors had flagged as threatening court officers and intimidating potential witnesses. Court records show multiple warnings had already been issued in earlier hearings. Those warnings expired the second the judge was interrupted. Within the hour, an 11-page written order was filed containing language rarely seen in federal proceedings, stating that the defendant had shown a fundamental unwillingness to comply with court authority and that continued release posed an unacceptable risk to the integrity of the judicial process. And it didn't stop there. Investigators had reportedly been building the revocation case quietly for weeks. Despite explicit orders to limit public commentary, the defendant continued posting online, referencing cooperating witnesses by initials, language prosecutors described as thinly veiled threats. Screenshots, timestamps, and expert assessments were already assembled. Former prosecutors reviewing the case say the order was essentially ready. The courtroom explosion simply triggered its execution. Even as Marshals flanked him, witnesses say the defendant continued speaking, insisting he was being silenced. Statements Judge Caldwell immediately incorporated into the record, noting that the continued disruption would factor into sentencing considerations if a conviction followed. Reporters described the room as electrically silent, the kind of silence that signals history just happened. A veteran courtroom sketch artist later said she had never seen authority asserted so completely without raised voices or spectacle. When the defendant was escorted through the side door and attempted to turn back toward the gallery, Marshals physically redirected him. The door closed, and without missing a beat, Judge Caldwell addressed remaining counsel, called a brief recess, and announced the court would proceed with pending motions upon return, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred except everything had. Legal scholars are now comparing this moment to some of the most infamous courtroom confrontations in American history. noting what makes this different isn't just the removal, but the immediate collapse of two normally separate processes, contempt enforcement and bail revocation, into a single decisive act backed by a meticulously built record. Some defense attorneys are calling it terrifying. Former prosecutors are calling it a masterclass. Appellate experts say overturning this decision will be extraordinarily difficult because the documentation is airtight, and the broader implications are already rippling through federal courts nationwide. Defense lawyers are warning clients. Judges are watching closely. The message sent was unmistakable. Federal courtrooms are not stages, defiance compounds consequences, and patience should never be mistaken for weakness. What unfolded in those explosive minutes wasn't just the removal of one defendant, it was a statement, delivered live, recorded forever, and now studied across the legal world as a defining example of what happens when judicial authority is tested one time too many.